Hello everyone, welcome to the Rise in Waters podcast.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Steph, and we specialise in flood resilience and community engagement.
Today we're diving into what flooding means to us and to different people. For some, it's all about sandbags and levees, while others think of community workshops and emergency plans.
Lately, flood risk management has expanded to include equipping people with the knowledge and resources they need to bounce back from incidents and giving them the power to take hold of this ever-increasing threat.
As part of the engagement team, our biggest challenge is getting people to think about flooding before it happens.
A recent Red Cross survey showed significantly low awareness of flood risk among communities and businesses who actually are at high risk.
In our experience, every community is unique. Some have a wealth of local knowledge that can significantly aid flood risk management.
The key is finding these people, asking the right questions, and also being able to not only listen, but give them space to be heard.
We'll also discuss the challenges in communicating flood risk, such as misinformation and explaining risk percentages.
Trusting authorities and previous experiences with flooding also play significant roles in that communication.
Building trust and credibility is crucial. We'll cover strategy for establishing trust between authorities and experts and community members.
Local knowledge and past experiences are invaluable in developing effective flood risk management plans. We'll touch on promoting resilience and adaptive behaviours, looking at successful initiatives, technology and innovation.
So today we welcome two guest speakers. We have Phil. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Phil Rothwell and I'm the chair of a regional committee that looks after flood risk in Northumbria.
Brilliant. And then we have Ed Rollason.
Hi, I'm a lecturer in geography at Northumbria University, and I also sit as an independent expert on the committee that Phil chairs.
Brilliant. Could you give us a little bit more into your backgrounds and sort of what you've, like sort of a bit of a history, maybe a very light history of your work to do with flooding particularly? Let's start with you, Phil.
Yeah, sure. I started my life working in nature conservation, actually, and I was particularly interested in wetland nature conservation, which seems quite appropriate. And then I sort of gravitated from there via the Royal Society of Protection of Birds to the Environment Agency. And for a while, I was Deputy Director of Flood Policy for the Environment Agency. And so my recent history is very much about the scale of flood risk, determining where's going to flood and who will be affected, and then thinking of solutions as to how we sort of retrieve the situation and try and keep people as safe as possible.
Yes, quite a career in flooding specifically. Brilliant.
Yes, absolutely. I retired in 2013, and I've been doing bits of freelance work ever since, including chairing the wonderful Northumbrian Regional Flood and Coastal Committee.
Brilliant. How about you, Ed?
My background training is in physical geography. I'm actually a fluvial geomorphologist originally, so I'm interested in how rivers work physically. And I spent about 10 years as a consultant working for an engineering firm where we did flood risk assessment and to support kind of planning and the development of housing schemes. And I then decided that I'd had enough of that, came out into academia and did a PhD in interdisciplinary geography, looking at the relationship between sort of flood planning and management and how people are kind of involved in those processes. And my research since then has largely followed that. So I'm interested in the physical aspects of how rivers work. I do a certain amount of kind of numerical modeling and simulation and things like that. But I'm primarily interested in people and kind of how people interact with river systems, whether that's from planning flood management schemes or whether it's what happens kind of during and after floods.
Brilliant. So today we're kind of looking at community perception of their flood risk. And so what are your first thoughts? What are your sort of first feelings about that topic in general?
I think community is such a broad term, really, and how a community sees its flood risk depends on many different factors. What other things are going on in their lives? Are there other things like a waste tip at the end of the road, or they can't get their children to school because it's busy, or whatever? Flood risk doesn't always come top of mind unless they've been flooded before. And there's a big difference between communities that have experienced flooding and those that haven't, and often think, well, it'll never happen to us, when actually it might. And so that there are some big differences there, and also how mobile communities are. If you've got a community that's been there a long time, there's not much change, they tend to know a lot about the history of their area, and they know about flooding and risk and so on. But if it's a very mobile community, community, a commuter community or something like that, then they tend to have less connection with their local environment. And so it is very different depending on where you go. Quite hard to summarize, really.
Yeah, would you say that knowledge really plays into their resilience in general as well?
Yeah, I would, absolutely. Yes, I think, and some communities are more coherent than others, and they work together, and often led by an individual. If you've got someone who's really keen, and they will motivate that community, but that isn't always the case.
No. How about you, Ed?
I'd agree with Phil. We tend to throw around the word community a little bit too simplistically for my likings. Phil said community within a community of place, so a town or a village or something like that. There might be a dozen different communities within that. So the really important thing is that those people are all talking to each other and are all able to work together and as and when flooding occurs. So I think in some ways perceptions of risk are useful. There isn't a lot of research to show that having a high perception of risk actually encourages people to take action. And again, there's a slight difference between knowing that flooding occurs and how it occurs and perceiving that as a risk. And I've worked with communities who have been flooded before and who have had quite a high perception of risk, but still haven't really known the correct action to take in advance of floods, because most communities' experience of floods is either historical or they've experienced a flood which is not necessarily how it happens the next time. It's very rare to have two floods that are the same, right? So you'll have a community which perceives that it is at risk, takes action to manage the last flood, and the next flood is a third larger than the flood that they've had, and actually they still end up in a disastrous situation.
And there's also the falsehood of having just experienced a flood, and that if you sort of read into that information sometimes that is given out that it's a 1 in a 50-year flood, they think, we've had our flood, so it won't happen again for another 50 years. And that terminology can really trip people up and communities in general. I think we found that.
I think it can definitely be quite misleading, that terminology, and it's certainly something we see when we're engaging with our communities and we try to explain, it's a 1 in 30-year flood. Like, it's fine then, that's okay. It's quite challenging terminology.
It's very difficult, and getting people's perception of risk nailed is quite hard. And I think you're right. I mean, the 1 in 30, 1 in 1,000 year, I mean, that's almost sort of out of date language now, because it relies on you looking backwards in any case. And, you're looking back over 200 years of flood data might well give you the impression that this only happened once every 30 years or once every 50 years. But looking to the future will be nothing like the past, because climate change has made such a difference. And whereas people would think that, if I live near a river, I might be at risk, they hadn't really factored in that. In one of the big floods that I dealt with when I was with the agency was in 2008. About 70,000 properties were flooded, and almost all of them were from water on its way to the river, not water on its way out of the river. And it was all surface water caused by massive downpours, torrential downpours in a very small area, which we're now seeing much more. And getting that across to people that it's quite difficult to predict where some of these floods are going to be.
Yeah, and you think just about the, even in Newcastle, the 2012 floods as a sort of really... poignant. When you were just talking there, I was just harkening back to that, and the Sardine Street. I've got a clip that I can show you, and it was just it's just coming down the stairs like waterfalls. And I think there's a brilliant moment where there's a Geordie lad just witnessing it, and it's got a wonderful quote on it. Is that a waterfall or what? Yeah, it was really something to see, and I think it woke a lot of people up, because I think it was a full month of rain had fallen in a couple of hours, and we're seeing that more and more, especially sitting here in 2024 when we're recording this, and we've had probably the wettest year that I've noticed.
Floods that we've responded to in this past kind of 6 months over this past winter have primarily been surface water rather than fluvial or from a river. So we are definitely seeing the increase in that, and not just the intensity, but just the frequency of how often this is happening now, and that it's not just in the winter as some people expect. They think, that's when we got our bad weather, that's when it'll happen, but going into the summer months, and it really carries on throughout the whole year, so there's no kind of safe time. Is that something that you've kind of witnessed as well, that it can be a seasonal thing that people might see flood risk as?
Yeah, I think there's a feeling that it's always a winter thing or an autumn thing, or doesn't happen in the summer.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at some of the really big floods, Boscastle, a place somewhere in the southwest, I was in Australia at the time, and I was looking at the news and saw this huge flooding in Boscastle, and I thought, what's happening here? Because I think it was August.
Yeah.
And increasing the time is no longer relevant either. It seems to be able to happen. Seems to happen at any time. And we've had a particularly wet year this year, so it's been grim.
Yeah, well, I think this has been the wettest year on record, actually. So all of this that we are seeing is in fact getting worse, and due to climate change, and is probably going to continue to go that way.
Yeah, I think the wake-up call was in 2008 when we realised that of 70,000 houses flooded, almost all of them were surface water. And then we started looking at the ancient housing we've got, the Victorian and later housing estates, where their drainage systems are not built for the sorts of rainfall we're now getting. New developments are much better at absorbing rainfall and thinking about how you design them. But if you live in an older area, then your drainage system is designed for Victorian weather often, and Victorian weather ain't the weather we get now.
No, definitely not.
Definitely. But it's funny you brought that up. We had a conversation with a friend very recently about that. He'd heard that I'd work in flooding, and he'd said to me, it's always rained, and we've got the same drains, and what's the difference now? And I was like, well, let me tell you. And I sat him down for about half an hour and lectured him on that exact topic.
I was looking at storm drains in Perth in Australia earlier in the year, and they would swallow an Alsatian. They're massive. You could lose a mini down them because they expect big rainfall, and therefore they're geared up for it. Whereas you look at our draining system, and it's just not really right. And so, and of course, the cost then. The committee I work on is looking at the cost of flood defence, the cost of reduction in flooding, and you look at the cost of retrofitting the right flood risk management kit in urban areas, and it is outrageously expensive. It's very, very expensive.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially trying to replace a whole drainage system sometimes. And I know some areas that we've worked in have put in now surface water drainage additionally when they've off the back of having really bad flooding, but it is very expensive. It takes up a lot of time. It, causes massive disruption. It's not as simple sometimes as I think people might realise.
So I think just going back to a little bit about that risk communication, there's also a little bit of something to be said for trust and in sort of authorities and things like that, and the links between that people have available to them. And I think one of the things that we've discovered in our work, particularly in some locations, is that there is this perception that there's very little sort of resource, and actually in some places that it can prove to be true. And so a lot of the work that we do is about finding that resource and trying to connect the community with them. Do you find, I think, Ed, you maybe had a look at this with Cleveland potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. And so academic researchers call this social capital. So the linkages between social groups that allow them to share resources, either expertise or money or physical resources, kind of through time and space. And there is an argument to be made that is the foundation of resilience, because ultimately when a flood occurs, even though we talk about kind of emergency responders and first responders, when a flood occurs, the people who are immediately there to help are the people who are within that community. And when you look at disasters more broadly than flooding, most of the kind of self-rescue that occurs in all situations is from people who live within the vicinity. So having that network of people who are capable of coming together to react to events as they occur, kind of in the first hour, 2 hours of these things, is really important. And the more capacity those people have to draw on diverse networks who might have alternative expertise or alternative resources. In rural communities, you often see that with farmers who are capable of bringing in tractors, for example. You can drive a tractor through 4-5 feet of water in a way that a car you just can't.
Yeah.
So their ability to kind of access places and to help support communities that are in difficulties with flooding is quite high.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perhaps something that you don't necessarily see in urban communities, or as Phil was saying earlier, with kind of transient communities where you've got lots of turnover. Those networks don't exist. So those communities are particularly vulnerable when they get affected by floods.
I think that was a thought process around the flood warning service as well. I believe that if it's a severe enough warning, that if you're traveling through a location, it will actually ping on your phone going through. So there's starting to be that conversation around the transient nature, but still some way to go, I think, with it.
I think the point about the difference between rural and urban is quite interesting, because you're right, Ed's right about rural communities are quite resilient in their own right. They've often had to fend for themselves in, blizzards and storm and snow and wind and God knows what. And so there's a sort of there seems to be more of a people there to help themselves sort of vibe, compared to urban areas, which are slightly different. But planning to do something about flood risk, rural areas are quite hard, because often you just get one or two properties that flood, rather than in an urban area you often get 100 at a time, and it's much cheaper to be able to manage 100 at a time than it is deal with some of these rural problems. So the nature of the rural community is really important if it's not possible to do much to stop flooding happening.
I think you mentioned earlier when we were speaking just off recording about a area in Northumberland that had come together and kind of brought their money together to help each other.
Yes, in order to deal with individual properties flooding, there was government grant aid made available to make your own property more resilient. And Tyne Green in not far away from here, there were, I think, half a dozen properties. All were able to get this grant, but then realised if they clubbed together, rather than have individual property protection, they could have a much better defence that would protect them all. And I think our committee actually threw a bit of money in as well, and then that made a much more sensible use of funds. So that is possible but that isn't possible everywhere. But it's worth looking at. So.
Would you say that the kind of characteristics of that community, were they quite close knit? Do you think that's how that was able to come together? Because you might go to some places where people don't really know each other, so they wouldn't necessarily think of putting all of the money together and the grants to do something like that. So do you think that played a part in what happened there?
Yeah, I think they were already a fairly coherent community, and I think they also had a local councillor who was resident, and that always helps quite a lot.
It does,
influence. So they were very much. I think they were already talking to each other and discussing how to deal with their problem. But the money came along as a sort of happen chance, really, that made it possible.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So we've kind of gone over rural and urban, and sort of even into the sort of economic status, and we touched on briefly sort of a bit of trust and credibility, and sort of that really difficult area which can occur, especially when you're dealing with some of the authorities. There's a real difference in trust depending on the community, we find sometimes, and we find it a more difficult space to work in when the community doesn't have that trust already built in. So another part of that is also understanding how that authority responds to flooding as well, and whether the community sees that as a failure or a success can really affect how much they trust someone in the future. Would you say there was anything that you can do to address that? Is there something that, in a perfect world, what would we have?
Yeah, and the research you referred to in Cleveland earlier on looked at working with a couple of communities in the Cleveland area to think about kind of what resilience was and how resilience was built, both kind of from an agency perspective and from a community perspective. And there is this big disjoint between what agencies are trying to do and the way that they're trying to do it, and kind of how communities react. And it encompasses this whole space that we've been talking about. But there are organisations who are already kind of bridge that gap and already have that kind of emplaced position, trusted position often within communities, because they provide, say, housing associations, they provide a they provide a service that is there all the time. Various third sector organisations, so charities, also youth workers, things like that, do that as well. And they're kind of boundary organisations, so they sit across the interface between communities and agencies, and perhaps thinking about resilience more broadly. So rather than just thinking about it in the context of flooding, but saying actually these communities are faced by a great range of challenges. These organisations can almost mediate between a great load of agencies who all have their different individual messages, and the communities who, as Phil kind of mentioned earlier, they're worried about getting kids to school, they're worried about being able to heat their houses, they're being worried about antisocial behaviour, whatever it is. It's not flooding, but knowing that you can reach out to those people through organisations that they trust already, I feel is probably the way forward, rather than every single different agency trying to say something different.
Yeah. And we work together and kind of find those stakeholders that have the greatest reach to the people that we want to get to the most. Yeah.
And I think doing that also helps you get to know that community better. If you know what those important groups or organisations are, often it might be a kind of a community group within, that certain place, and that is something that's normally quite embedded within that community. And I think working with them and helping in that way can often kind of bridge that relationship a bit. I know certainly with some of the communities I've gone into, that's what I've done. I've firstly gone to a certain community group who appears to do a lot in the community, and it just helps. It's useful for me as well as I think the community themselves.
Yeah, and we've come across some incredible community groups that have just really taken hold. They'll just be kind of already existing, doing those things, and somehow they still manage to make time for us as well.
Yeah,
and I think that's whenever I get that, I'm always like, oh, thank you so much for listening. And
because I think they often, they'll probably get questions. If that community has experienced flooding, or if it is a worry for some of the residents, they, as a trusted kind of point of contact, they'll speak to them, and they might not necessarily have those answers, because that's just not what they specialize in. They don't necessarily know. So I think sometimes when we can then work with them to give that information and have it in an accessible way like that, often comes across really well.
Yeah.
And that's social capital in action, right?
Yeah.
Like you are then linked to the rest of that community through that organisation. So when a flood occurs, or when a flood warning arrives, they speak to somebody that they trust, and that person that they trust can then either get that information or can simply relay that information.
I think one of the biggest threats to that is attrition and staff attrition, because if we make or even volunteer attrition, someone will move out of an area or something like that, and there's just a huge loss that sometimes you don't realize how much until when you go back to that community and you're like, you kind of want to start, speaking again, because you've been out of it for a year, and then it almost feels like starting again. Just because you've lost that one person who really does connect everybody in that as a stakeholder in that community. Yeah.
And charities and volunteers have been fighting that problem for decades. So that's probably not something that we can fix.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those we try to manage as best as we can, and I think our team, we keep a log now of what we do in each
and
community,
of our contacts as well. So who is a stakeholder in that area essentially, and who are these kind of important people that make those connections to the wider community. And I think we really make an effort to have frequent communication with them, so that if there are any changes to staffing or anything like that we're aware of it, and we can really work with them or get to know the new staff, and it can kind of enhance that handover period as well, which means that we're not losing out on someone moving on to something else, but we can build on it and keep going.
Yeah, and just kind of looking at that coming back to us. So something that's really important, and something very, in fact, it's probably more important, is with the amount of feedback we get from the community, and sort of their even if they're not knowledgeable about the specific risk, or even that there is a flood risk, they have so many connections, and they know so much about their local area that can actually really help flood risk, even management and planning and things like that. And so it's really important that we hold that a space for them to be heard, and not just us kind of going into a community being like, this is your flood risk, here's all your awareness, and then we just go. We kind of want to actually sit and listen first, and say to the community, you know, we're here to hear what you've got to say, and then we can exchange, and have a two-way conversation.
And I mean, that's certainly something I've done whenever I'm going into a community for the first time. I'll look at like the community centres and things like that, and I'll often host a session where I just get them to come and talk to me, and I just basically listen to what they've got to say. So if there's any history of the flood risk, what their perception is of it now, what they think's been done or what needs to be done. And I think just listening to that can often really start to build a relationship and really build a lot of trust. I've been in some communities where there really has been quite a fractured relationship, and just doing that has really created quite a step into starting something more there. So I think listening is something that is very underestimated, but really works as long as you then act on it as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you both have got quite a bit of work in this area of listening and working with communities, and sort of, I wondered, Phil, if you have anything to kind of add to that.
Well, I think the trust is an interesting question, isn't it? Whether people trust the agencies, or they trust local government, or trust and they more often than not just trust local themselves, really, and they trust local people. I can think of an example in Norfolk, which a town that was often flooded by the sea, actually, in certain weather conditions, and they were all signed up to the usual Environment Agency warnings and that sort of thing, and they all had door guards to put when the sea got too high. But the person they really listened to was the guy at the end of the street who'd lived there for 70 years, and he knew exactly when, and he would knock on doors, and he'd go, you know, before we had flood wardens, he was there, and they would listen to him, and long before the yellow jacketed Environment Agency staff rolled up or whatever. So these individual leaders are quite interesting in communities, and I mean, we try and do that with flood wardens, obviously, but I remember actually, you know, 20 years ago there was some research by DEFRA who realised that community leaders were really important. How do you get them? How do you find them? How do you pull them out and use them? And sometimes in communities they can be a bit of a pain. I'm sure the local neighbourhood watch person constantly knocking on your door, but actually if they didn't do it, who would?
Exactly.
And so I think it's really important that we can find leaders within local communities. One of the tricks we used it was a major urban scheme where we were re-engineering. It was a trapezoidal channel, you know, it was just a concrete channel through a park, and we were trying to re-engage people with the park and do flood risk management. And it took 2 years, and we put a member of staff there and who lived in the area for that 2 years, and he became a local fixture, and he was helping people with their groceries as well as telling them about flood risk all the time. And that's what you needed to do in a community that didn't really trust what you were doing and felt it was all a bit odd, you know, a bit difficult. So I think, you know, there's seeking out those people and utilizing them, but you're right, then they disappear, and what do you do? So you've got to somehow revitalize it. But I think to big up ourselves really in the Northeast. There are 12 regional flood and coastal committees that I described earlier around the country, and we're the only one that really invests in staff to engage with local communities. And that's because the committee, which is made up of 12 councillors and experts such as Ed, believes that this is the right way forward, because you can't protect everybody all the time everywhere. And the more people understand risk and feel comfortable talking about it, then the easier your job is, even if it's difficult. And you know, the roles that you two play are just extraordinary, because that's all about what you just described. It's about making friends with communities, listening to them, understanding how they receive information, because people receive information in different ways and see things in different ways. But you can understand that, and you can be there, and you can't be there all the time, but at least you can put people in place who can be part of that community, and they feel they can go to. And it isn't just flooding, it's across all the things that Ed mentioned earlier about you know, things that people worry about their local community.
And I think even often, although we're there to speak about the flood risk, because we do, you know, form quite, you know, tight relationships with these communities, we do often find out about all these other worries and things that are bigger priorities to that community. And I think it's about listening to that and understanding, and also kind of trying to aid that understanding of their flood risk at the same time, because as you've both kind of said, you know, some people of being much more worried about the cost of living crisis. Now they're going to put food on the table,
Absolutely.
and flood risk isn't really something that really worried about. But when we go and listen to that and say, okay, yeah, we get that, but here are a few really quick things that you can do, take you about 5 minutes, and even if it's just signing up to the flood warnings, then that is something that's going to help protect them, but is not going to take up their time, doesn't cost them any money. And it's, I think, getting that balance of trying to make sure that we're doing our jobs and make sure that people are aware of that flood risk, but understanding that it's not everyone's top priority.
And if anyone wants to hear
they'll
about
also,
those,
they'll also have information which we won't have access to. They'll know where people who are disabled are. They'll know where elderly people who struggle, where deaf people are. Where, they will know that information. And you have to. That's really important. Social capital. It's socially, it's socially really important when it comes to thinking how people respond. And they will have practical information. I remember years ago we had a 3D model of a town that flooded regularly, and we were able to manipulate it so you could bring the water up. And somebody said, "You got that wrong. The chip shop always floods before the bakery." And so they had real practical information that helped us then design the flood defence or design. So no, they're a huge resource, both in terms of information but solution.
Yeah, and I think people don't always understand the value that this local knowledge has. They think, oh, well, yeah, we know that house always floods first. And they don't always understand that that's actually really useful information that we can use to then put into modelling, which can then end up being part of flood alleviation schemes. And just those little bits of local knowledge can be so useful. And Ed, I don't know if you've seen anything where that's been really useful, that local knowledge and enforcing.
Yeah, absolutely. And a chunk of my research is actually about the use of local knowledge kind of in more traditionally scientific risk management and numerical modeling, things like that. And using communities as a resource rather than just kind of rolling in and saying this is what we're going to do kind of helps with basically everything that we've been talking about today. So they feel heard because you've kind of listened to them the problem, and you're actually using their data to help your modeling. And I've demonstrated in some of my research that we can use community generated data sets to actually kind of validate the models that we build, so to demonstrate that they work or they don't work, and locations where walls overtop and drains surcharge and that kind of thing, and kind of entering into that partnership approach with a community and saying, actually, well, we've got access to this suite of kind of expert knowledges, which are all about engineering and science with a capital S. But in reality, you guys are the experts in kind of your everyday experience of place can be really important. And it's also so that helps build that trust. And it's also a really good exercise in understanding where the limits of that community's knowledge are, because, and again, a phrase that was coined a few years ago, sort of prison of experience, where communities get into this kind of bubble where they think they understand the flood risk that they're in, but actually, as I said earlier, that flood is a relatively minor one. It didn't do very much damage, but they think that's what's going to happen next time. And Phil was saying the importance of community leaders. That's not always positive. That kind of non-trusting relationship is something that you can unpick through actually working through the kind of risk knowledge and mapping exercise and saying, look, this is our understanding of risk. Let's look at your understanding of risk and let's discuss why these two things don't overlap.
Yeah, and I guess that also kind of brings to light to make sure, even though you might have a really trusted member of the community, to just do a bit of your own kind of fact checking as well, and see what the other, like the environment agencies saying, or your local council, and get all of the opinions and to see what's going on, because I know we've had something very similar this past year. So I think it's definitely important for people to check. It's good to get all the voices, I think, and certainly some members of the community can be very, very useful, but just double check these things, I think.
And it can be, it is, and that's also an issue with flooding in general, isn't it? It is that unpredictable in the sense that half of the community can be ready to evacuate and sort of thinking this is going to happen again, especially if it's previously experienced. And then the other half community be like, no, we've heard from certain sources or whatever, and we think actually this is going to be okay. And depending on what happens, depends on like whose trust is broken, and really the flood is the line there, which can make or break that. And you know, being taken away from that as well, you just want to make sure that, you know, you're getting your sources right, and, you know, Met Office, Environment Agency, you want those kind of look at those first information bits to you first before you then make a decision and follow someone else, especially if it's on social media. Which I think I've got a little tiny bit to talk about, in a sense that it can be a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen that as well over this past winter, where it can be great in getting messaging out really quickly. People are often on their phones now and checking news reports and everything, and so we'll often find out about potential flooding a lot quicker. However, we also have the other side of it, where we're potentially seeing false information going out there and worrying people unnecessarily, or the other way around, and making people think that everything's going to be okay when it's perhaps not. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a real danger in relying on social media because, as I said earlier, where people accept information in different ways. And some people like to talk to people, some people listen to the radio, some people listen to podcasts. You know, and it tends to be age differentiated. You know, so it's quite hard to reach everybody using one medium. That's impossible. But I did social media, sure, has a part to play, and it's very important. And a lot of people will get their information from social media. How you deal with the wrong information, that's really hard.
Yes, yeah.
Because you've got to be on top of it, and, you know, rebuttal goes out as soon as possible. But there's some very clever use of social media, which I think brings out the understanding in people. But it's not something which I would rely on its own. I think there's so much else you have to do alongside it.
Yeah, how weird.
Yeah, I think again, it's a trust thing, isn't it? Like being able to have your message somewhere hosted, somewhere where people trust, and where it's very clear and as unequivocal as you can make it, and encouraging people to be message savvy, right, and questioning the things that they're being told. And again, this is not just a problem for flood risk, right? This is disinformation is a problem more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember. I think we were talking about a little while ago. Even just the news, not just social media, can also have a bit of a spin on that, and that sort of sensationalism is sort of something that makes it into journalism in general, and can make something feel worse. And you think about the well-being of the people watching as well, and sort of that might have gone through that, seeing your town on the news for something as disastrous as that, and they're capturing all the worst bits, and it might not have affected you, but you might think, oh, gosh, is this going to happen to me? And that can increase the anxiety as well. But there's other more positive stories that can come out of the news, like, for example, your snowman clip, which I thought was brilliant, by the way. But yeah, because you appeared on the BBC to dispel a bit of misinformation that maybe not misinformation, but a bit of information that had gone around.
Yes, I was working for the agency at that time, but one of our staff suggested that building large snowmen was a good way of holding water back. And this hit the front page of the Daily Mirror, I think, much to his dismay. And then we ended up on national media. Andrew Neil, I think, on the politics show, brought it out as a jokey item. And I think I was interviewed on College Green in the freezing cold with people throwing snowballs at me, talking about it. But it was a jokey way of getting across a real issue. You know, where I suppose that, yes, vast armies of large snowmen might well hold back some water.
Yeah,
you know,
not wrong.
The physics is there, because what's the last bit of snow to melt on your garden, on your lawn? You know, it's the snowman you built with your children. So yes, there was some physics behind it, some reality behind it. But the real message was, well, you know, don't rely on that. There's all sorts of other ways of understanding flood risk. Sign up for your flood risk warnings and that sort of thing. And it gave us an opportunity in a humorous way to get a serious message across, which I think was good.
Yeah, it was brilliant. It was a great use, I think.
Yeah, it was
definitely.
fun.
Definitely.
I think a lot of technology now is exerted in trying to predict where is likely to flood.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, we described it earlier about the wrong terminology now, and I think we're catching up now with much better forecasting and much better understanding of how the ground will react, but also better at cooperation. So, people often look for who to blame.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is it the agency? And I think the previous chief executive said it's like every drop of rain has got the agency's name on it. And that
does
was
feel
true.
like that sometimes.
Being poked all the time when actually it may have been sewer flooding overcharge of a sewer, which might be a water company problem. It might be the drainage system along a road, which is a local authority problem, and often it's a combination of all three.
Yeah, it definitely often is, and I think people don't, and I mean rightly so, know who's responsible for each different part of flooding, because it is, it is a bit confusing. It's not the easiest. I
would love a plaque on every single flood defense we have which says this belongs to this person. Go ring them. Here's the number, and I'd love that would be amazing, just for someone to go and look and be like, right, cool, that's who I speak to. Yeah. Because sometimes we have communities being passed around to different pillar to post because they're not sure where to call first, and it can be quite difficult. I think
that's especially challenging if they have actually just experienced a flood.
Yeah,
and then they're not actually sure where they're supposed to go.
If you've got 1.5 feet of sewage-filled water in your living room, you
don't care.
You don't. The government thought it was a great idea to split up responsibility for different types of flood in 2010, in the hope that would encourage resource to be better divided out. That's not how. That's not how it has worked.
And it forced us as a committee to form the Northumbria Integrated Drainage Partnership, where all the key players sit together around a table and agree who's going to deal with what bit of flooding, and whose fault it might be, and therefore who's going to fix it. And so we've had to create that because of the way the government chose to split up the system, and it works really well. Actually, we devote many millions of pounds to the solutions that they come up with. So it's forced out of necessity.
And those studies, they're permanent. Once they're created, they're there for because funding changes all the time, right? We've got stuff opens up, stuff closes, and for that we can kind of look at you can look at that study and go, all right, but this is great. Now we can take that off the shelf. Hopefully it's not too far out of date. And we can kind of go, we can. It's like having a portfolio ready to go, isn't it? And I think that's something that's really important. So I think we might be coming to the end of our podcast today, which is wonderful. It's been lovely having you on, and I think it's really interesting some of the topics we've kind of talked about today, and a lot of the rest of the podcast will talk about those in a little bit more detail and a little bit more. We'll expand further. But you've been brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you.
No, it's been fun. It's good. I think it's really good, and good luck. I think it's going back to how do people receive messages. It's just one of the tools in our toolkit. But, podcasts are there are lots of them. Yes. So how do you make sure that yours? That's why we have a big yellow sign on there. How do you make sure that yours is going to be up there and being listened to? But brilliant. It's a great initiative. I'm delighted. Absolutely delighted.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. This episode of Rising Waters is made possible by all of our partners and volunteers. Make sure to check out the show notes or description for this episode to learn more about what you heard today.